The handcuffs weren't tight, but they were cold against my wrists as I sat in the back of the police cruiser, watching my 3 adult children walk away from me through the rear window. Lucas didn't look back once. Emma kept wiping her eyes, but her steps never faltered. Sarah paused at her car door, turned slightly as if she might return, then shook her head and drove off into the night. Officer Rodriguez had been kind enough not to activate the sirens, but the flashing red and blue lights painted everything in an alternating glow that made the whole scene feel surreal, like something from a movie I never wanted to star in. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Ma'am, you have the right to remain silent, he had said earlier, his voice gentle but professional. I almost laughed at the irony. Silent. That's what I'd been for 34 years of motherhood, and look where it had gotten me. My own children had called the police on me, told them I was mentally unstable, and a danger to myself. All because I'd finally found my voice, and they didn't like what I had to say. The station was quieter than I expected, filled with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional shuffle of paperwork. Detective Maria Santos sat across from me in the interview room, her dark eyes kind but observant. She was younger than my youngest daughter, probably in her early 20s, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd seen enough of human nature to not be easily surprised. "Mrs. Chambers," she said, sliding a cup of lukewarm coffee across the metal table, "your children are very concerned about you. They say you've been acting erratically, making threats, behaving in ways that have them worried for your safety and theirs." She paused, studying my face. "What's your side of this story?" I stared into the coffee, watching the fluorescent lights reflect off its surface like tiny stars. "How do you explain that the people who are supposed to love you most in the world have just proven they don't know you at all? How do you tell a stranger that you've spent decades being exactly what everyone needed you to be, only to discover that the moment you tried to be yourself, you became the enemy?" "Detective Santos," I said quietly, lifting my eyes to meet hers. "Have you ever loved someone so much that you forgot you existed?" She tilted her head slightly, and I could see I had her attention. Because that's what I did for 34 years. I forgot I existed. And when I finally remembered, my children decided I was the problem. My name is Violet Rose Chambers, and until 6 months ago, I believed that being a good mother meant disappearing completely into that role until there was nothing left of the woman I used to be. I was born on a snowy February morning in 1965 in Boise, Idaho, to parents who taught me that love was a verb, not a feeling. My father, Robert Sullivan, worked double shifts at the lumber mill to keep our small family afloat. My mother, Catherine, took in sewing from the wealthier families in town, her fingers working late into the night by lamplight, hemming dresses, and mending tears with the kind of precision that comes from necessity rather than choice. We lived in a narrow 2-story house on Maple Street, with peeling yellow paint and a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. The neighborhood wasn't poor exactly, but it wasn't prosperous either. It was the kind of place where people worked hard for everything they had and never took anything for granted. Our backyard was mostly dirt and weeds, but my mother had carved out a small vegetable garden along the back fence where she grew tomatoes and lettuce and green beans that stretched our grocery budget just a little further. I was an only child, which in our economic circumstances was probably a blessing, though I didn't understand that then. What I understood was that my parents worked constantly, that money was always tight, and that the way to show love was through service. My mother never said "I love you" while she braided my hair for school each morning, but her fingers were gentle and sure, and she always made sure my ribbons matched my dress. My father never talked about feelings while he helped me with my homework at the kitchen table after his long days, but he was patient with my questions and proud of my good grades in a quiet way that made me want to earn more of them. I learned early that the easiest way to please the adults in my life was to be helpful, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to make myself useful in small but meaningful ways. I started doing my own laundry when I was 8, not because anyone asked me to, but because I noticed how tired my mother looked folding endless piles of clothes. I began helping my father with small repairs around the house when I was 10, holding flashlights and passing tools, watching him work with the focused concentration of someone who couldn't afford to hire professionals. School came easily to me, which was fortunate since good grades were the only path out of Maple Street that my family could afford. I was a serious student, the kind who always turned in assignments early and stayed after class to ask questions. I wasn't particularly popular, but I wasn't unpopular either. I existed in that middle space of students who teachers liked and classmates forgot, which suited me fine. I had bigger dreams than high school social circles. Those dreams centered around college, specifically around becoming a nurse. I'd decided on this career path when I was 12, after spending a week in the hospital with pneumonia and being cared for by a woman named Margaret, who treated me with such kindness and competence that I wanted to be just like her. Nursing seemed like the perfect profession for someone like me, someone who found purpose in taking care of others, someone who was good at anticipating needs and solving problems quietly and efficiently. I worked every summer from the time I was 14, saving every penny I earned for college. I babysat for neighbors, cleaned houses, worked at the local ice cream parlor scooping cones and wiping tables. My parents helped as much as they could, but we all understood that my education would be primarily my own responsibility. I applied for every scholarship I could find, wrote essays about growing up working class and wanting to serve my community, spent my senior year of high school in a constant state of anxiety about whether I'd be able to afford the future I'd been planning. The acceptance letter from Boise State University came with a partial scholarship that would cover about 60% of my tuition. Combined with my savings and a work-study job, it would be enough. Barely, but enough. I remember the moment. I told my parents, standing in our small kitchen while my mother stirred a pot of soup and my father read the newspaper at the table. They both smiled, my mother reaching over to squeeze my hand, and my father nodding in that restrained way that meant he was proud but didn't quite know how to express it. College was harder than I'd expected. Not academically, but emotionally. I was surrounded by classmates who seemed so much more confident and worldly than I felt. Students who talked casually about spring break trips and sorority parties while I worked 20 hours a week in the campus dining hall and worried about textbook costs. I lived in the cheapest dorm room available, shared with a roommate who went home every weekend to do her laundry at her parents' house, while I fed quarters into the basement machines and ate ramen noodles for dinner more nights than I care to remember. But I loved my nursing classes with an intensity that surprised even me. There was something deeply satisfying about learning how to care for people in the most fundamental ways, how to ease pain and promote healing and provide comfort during the most vulnerable moments of human existence. My clinical rotations were challenging but fulfilling, and I discovered I had a natural aptitude for the work, an intuitive understanding of what patients needed even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. It was during my junior year, in a pediatric rotation at St. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Joseph's Hospital, that I met David Michael Chambers. He was a resident physician, 3 years older than me, with sandy brown hair and green eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He was assigned to supervise my clinical group, and from the first day I was struck by how gentle he was with the children, how he could make a scared 4-year-old laugh while administering a vaccination or calm an anxious parent with just the right combination of medical expertise and human warmth. David noticed me too, though it took me weeks to realize it. He started finding excuses to check on my patients, to review my charts, to ask my opinion about treatment plans in front of the other students. I was flattered but confused. I'd never been the kind of girl who attracted attention from men like David, men who were smart and accomplished and destined for important careers. I was serious and studious, practical rather than pretty, the kind of woman who men respected but didn't usually pursue. But David was different. He seemed to appreciate my competence, my dedication, my genuine care for the patients we served, together. He started asking me to stay after rounds to discuss cases, conversations that gradually became more personal as we discovered shared values and similar backgrounds. His family was from a small town in Montana, and he'd worked his way through medical school with the same determination and financial creativity that had gotten me to nursing school. We started dating during my final semester, careful to keep our relationship professional during work hours, but spending our free time talking for hours about everything from medical ethics to favorite books to dreams for the future. David wanted to specialize in family medicine, to work in a community where he could build long-term relationships with patients and make a real difference in people's lives. I wanted to work in pediatrics, to care for children during some of their most frightening and painful experiences. When I graduated with my nursing degree, David was there in the audience, cheering louder than my own parents when my name was called. We'd been dating for 8 months by then, and I was deeply in love with him in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. He was everything I'd never dared to hope for in a partner. Kind, intelligent, ambitious, but not arrogant. Someone who shared my values and respected my career. David proposed 6 months later on Christmas Eve with a simple but beautiful ring that he'd chosen with input from my mother during a surprise visit to Boise. He'd driven 4 hours through a snowstorm to ask my father's permission, a old-fashioned gesture that touched me more than I could express. The proposal itself was perfect. Just the two of us in his small apartment with snow falling outside the windows and a fire crackling in the fireplace he'd insisted on despite the higher rent. We were married the following August, in a ceremony at my childhood church that was small but perfect. My mother made my dress, working for weeks to create something beautiful from a pattern she'd found in a magazine. David wore his father's suit, altered to fit, and looked more handsome than I'd ever seen him. We couldn't afford a honeymoon, but we spent 3 days at a cabin in the mountains that belonged to one of David's attending physicians, hiking during the day and talking about our future by firelight at night. David had been accepted into a family medicine residency in Denver, which meant we were moving to Colorado immediately after the wedding. I found a position at Children's Hospital, working in the pediatric intensive care unit with critically ill children and their families. It was demanding work, both physically and emotionally, but I loved it with a passion that sustained me through the long hours and difficult cases. Our first apartment in Denver was tiny, a 1-bedroom place with thin walls and no air conditioning that we could barely afford on our combined salaries. But it was ours, and I spent hours arranging and rearranging our wedding gifts and secondhand furniture to make it feel like home. David was working 80-hour weeks during his residency, often coming home exhausted and stressed, but we were happy in that particular way that young couples are when they're building something together from nothing. We talked constantly about our plans for the future. David wanted to finish his residency and then find a position in a small town where he could be the kind of doctor who delivered babies and treated everything from broken bones to diabetes to depression. I wanted to specialize in pediatric oncology, to work with children who were fighting cancer and their families who were navigating the most terrifying experience of their lives. Those early years of marriage were challenging but good. We were both working demanding jobs for modest pay, living paycheck to paycheck but optimistic about what lay ahead. We supported each other through the inevitable stresses of young careers and new marriage, celebrating small victories and weathering disappointments together. I loved watching David develop into the kind of physician he'd always wanted to be, and he encouraged my own professional ambitions with unwavering support. It was during David's final year of residency that we started seriously discussing having children. We'd always planned to have a family, but the timing had never felt right before. David would be finishing his training soon and hopefully finding a more stable position with better hours. I was established in my career and ready for the next chapter of our lives together. When I became pregnant with our first child at the age of 26, I was overwhelmed with joy and excitement. This was what we'd been working toward, the family we'd dreamed of during those long nights in medical school and residency. David was thrilled, already making plans for how he'd balance his career with being an involved father. We spent hours talking about what kind of parents we wanted to be, how we'd raise our children to be kind and responsible and confident. Lucas David Chambers was born on a crisp October morning in 1991, after 12 hours of labor that David coached me through, with the same calm competence he brought to his medical practice. Lucas was a beautiful baby, all serious dark eyes and perfect tiny features, and I fell in love with him with an intensity that took my breath away. Holding him for the first time, I understood for the first time what it meant to love someone, more than your own life. David was as smitten as I was, spending hours just watching Lucas sleep or holding him while he fussed. We were both exhausted those first few weeks, adjusting to the demands of caring for a newborn while managing our careers. But we were also blissfully happy. This was what we'd worked for, what we'd dreamed of, what felt like the culmination of everything we'd built together. I took 3 months of maternity leave, time that passed in a blur of feeding schedules and diaper changes, and the overwhelming responsibility of keeping this tiny person alive and thriving. When it came time to return to work, I felt torn between my love for nursing and my desire to spend every moment with my son. We found an excellent daycare near the hospital, but leaving Lucas there that first morning was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. David had finished his residency and accepted a position with a family practice in Aurora, a growing suburb of Denver. The job offered better hours and significantly better pay than what we'd been living on, which meant we could finally afford a real home. We found a small 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood with good schools and a backyard where we could imagine Lucas playing as he grew. Emma Catherine Chambers joined our family 2 years later, a easygoing baby who seemed to find joy in everything around her. She was Lucas's opposite in temperament, quick to smile and slow to fuss. The kind of child who made parenting look effortless even when it wasn't. With 2 children under the age of 3, our lives became more complicated but also richer in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I loved being a mother with an intensity that surprised me. I loved the weight of a sleeping baby against my chest, the sound of Lucas's laughter when David played airplane with him, the way Emma's face lit up when she saw me walk into a room. I loved the ordinary moments as much as the milestones. Bath, time and bedtime stories, first steps and first words, the 1,000 small intimacies that make up daily life with young children. When Sarah Michelle Chambers was born 3 years after Emma, our family felt complete in a way that I hadn't known we were missing something. Sarah was tiny but fierce, the kind of baby who seemed determined to keep up with her older siblings from the moment she opened her eyes. She crawled earlier than the others, walked sooner, talked constantly from the time she could form words. With 3 children under the age of 6, I made the decision to leave nursing and stay home full-time. It wasn't an easy choice professionally or financially, but David's practice was thriving, and we both felt that the children needed at least one parent who could be fully present during their early years. I missed the intellectual stimulation and sense of purpose that nursing had provided, but I found different rewards in full-time motherhood. I threw myself into the role with the same dedication I'd once brought to patient care. I researched child development and educational theory, organized playgroups and enrichment activities, documented every milestone with photographs and detailed baby books. I wanted to give my children the kind of childhood that would provide them with confidence and security, the foundation they'd need to become successful and happy adults. David was a wonderful father, engaged and affectionate when he was home, but his practice demanded long hours and frequent on-call responsibilities. The day-to-day reality of parenting fell mostly to me, and I didn't mind. I was good at it, and I found deep satisfaction in creating a stable, nurturing environment where my children could thrive. The years passed quickly, filled with birthday, parties and school events, soccer games and piano recitals, family vacations and holiday traditions. I volunteered extensively at their schools, chaperoned field trips, organized fundraisers, and coached Emma's softball team. I was the mother who always had snacks in her purse, who remembered every friend's name and birthday, who could solve most childhood crises with a combination of practical solutions and maternal wisdom. Lucas was academically gifted, showing an early aptitude for mathematics and science that made David beam with pride. He was serious and focused like his father, the kind of child who preferred books to television and approached new challenges with methodical determination. Emma was artistic and social, making friends easily and excelling in creative pursuits. She painted and drew constantly, filling our refrigerator with colorful artwork and our house with the sound of her singing. Sarah was precocious and determined, the youngest child who somehow managed to keep pace with her older siblings and often surpassed them in unexpected ways. She read voraciously from an early age, asked pointed questions that sometimes caught adults off guard, and displayed a sense of justice that was both admirable and occasionally exhausting. I was proud of all three of them, proud of the individuals they were becoming, and proud of the family we'd created together. David's practice continued to grow, providing us with financial security and allowing us to give the children opportunities we'd never had ourselves. We took family vacations to national parks and Disney World, enrolled them in music lessons and sports teams, started college savings accounts when they were still in elementary school. Those years felt like the reward for all the hard work and sacrifice that had come before. We were living the American dream, or at least our version of it. A successful husband, a devoted wife, 3 thriving children, and a beautiful home where we created memories that I believed would last a lifetime. But somewhere along the way, in the midst of all that devotion and sacrifice and service to my family, I lost track of who Violet Chambers was, apart from her roles as David's wife and the children's mother. I defined myself entirely through what I could provide for others, measuring my worth by how well I met their needs and how successfully I facilitated their happiness. It was a gradual disappearance, so subtle that I didn't notice it happening until it was complete. I stopped reading books that weren't related to child rearing or family management. I gave up hobbies that didn't serve some practical purpose. I lost touch with friends who weren't other mothers from school or the neighborhood. I stopped having opinions about anything that didn't directly affect my family's well-being. When people asked what I did, I said I was a stay-at-home mom, as if that explained everything about who I was. When they asked about my interests, I talked about my children's activities and achievements. When they asked about my dreams, I shared my hopes for my kids' futures. I had become a supporting character in other people's stories, essential but invisible, valued but never truly seen. The children flourished under this level of attention and devotion. Lucas graduated as valedictorian and earned a full scholarship to Stanford for computer science. Emma was accepted to several prestigious universities for journalism, ultimately choosing Northwestern. Sarah was courted by Harvard Law School, where she planned to study civil rights law. I was enormously proud of their achievements, of course. They were everything I'd hoped they would become: intelligent, ambitious, compassionate young adults who were prepared to make their mark on the world. But their success also marked the end of the only identity I'd known for 2 decades. When Sarah left for her freshman year at Harvard, the house felt impossibly quiet and empty. David was busier than ever with his practice, often working late or traveling to medical conferences. For the first time in 27 years, I was alone with myself, and I realized with growing alarm that I had no idea who that self was supposed to be. I tried to fill the void with activities that seemed appropriate for a woman in my position. I volunteered more extensively at local charities, joined book clubs and garden societies, took cooking classes and yoga workshops. But nothing felt substantial or meaningful in the way that raising my children had. I felt like I was playing a role rather than living a life, going through the motions of being fulfilled without actually feeling it. It was during this period of searching that I began to rediscover interests and opinions that had been dormant for decades. I started reading voraciously again, not just bestsellers and book club selections, but challenging novels and thought-provoking nonfiction. I enrolled in art classes at the community college, surprised to discover that I had a talent for watercolor painting that I'd never explored. I also began to have opinions about things beyond my family's immediate needs. I developed strong feelings about politics and social issues, about books and movies and current events. I started traveling occasionally with groups of other women, taking weekend trips to art museums and cultural events that David had never shown interest in. These changes were gradual and, I thought, fairly subtle. But my family noticed, and they didn't approve. David seemed bewildered by my new interests, dismissive of activities that didn't directly benefit our family or his career. The children, now adults with their own demanding lives, seemed to view my personal growth as selfish and inappropriate. They wanted me to remain the selfless, accommodating mother I'd always been, available whenever they needed me but content to fade into the background when they didn't. They expected me to be grateful for their occasional phone calls and holiday visits, to be satisfied with being a potential grandmother rather than a woman with her own desires and ambitions. The first real conflict came when I announced my intention to spend a month traveling through Europe with a group of women I'd met in my art class. It was something I'd been planning for months, a dream I'd held since college but never had the opportunity to pursue. I'd saved carefully for the trip, researched itineraries, and was excited in a way I hadn't been about anything in years. The children's reaction was immediate and negative. Lucas, now 32, and married to a woman who shared his conservative views about family obligations, thought it was irresponsible for me to spend that much money on something so frivolous. Emma, 29 and building her career as a journalist, worried that I was having some kind of midlife crisis and needed professional help. Sarah, 26 and fresh out of law school with strong opinions about everything, thought I was being selfish and inconsiderate of David's needs. They ganged up on me during a family dinner at David's in my house, the home where I'd raised them and where they still expected to be welcomed and catered to whenever convenient. They spoke over each other and over me, listing all the reasons why my travel plans were inappropriate for a woman of my age and station. They were worried about my safety, they said. They were concerned about the cost. They thought I was being impulsive and irresponsible. But what became clear as the argument continued was that they were really upset about something else entirely. They were angry that I was putting my own desires ahead of my availability to them. They were threatened by the idea that I might have a life and identity separate from my role as their mother. They wanted me to remain the woman who had sacrificed everything for their benefit, who found fulfillment solely in their achievements and happiness. I tried to explain that I was 58 years old, not 88. That I was perfectly capable of taking care of myself, that I'd earned the right to pursue my own interests after decades of putting everyone else first. But they wouldn't listen. In their minds, I was their mother, and mothers were supposed to be selfless and predictable and always available when needed. The argument escalated when Sarah, perhaps influenced by her recent legal training, started lecturing me about fiscal responsibility and suggesting that I might be experiencing some kind of cognitive decline that was affecting my judgment. Lucas nodded along, adding that maybe I should see a therapist before making any major decisions. Emma, tears in her eyes, said she just wanted me to be safe and happy, but clearly couldn't understand how traveling could contribute to either goal. David, who had been largely silent during the exchange, finally spoke up to suggest that maybe they had a point, that perhaps I should reconsider the trip and think about more appropriate ways to spend my time and money. It was the final betrayal, the moment when I realized that even my own husband saw me as a problem to be managed rather than a partner whose dreams deserved support. I stood up from the dining room table where we'd shared thousands of family meals, looked at the 4 people who were supposed to love me most in the world, and said something I'd never said before in 34 years of motherhood: no. The silence that followed was deafening. They stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language, as if the mother they thought they knew had been replaced by an imposter. And in a way, that's exactly what had happened. The selfless, accommodating woman who had defined herself entirely through service to others was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood that she had value beyond what she could provide to other people. I left the house that night knowing that something fundamental had shifted in my relationship with my family. They no longer saw me as a person with my own needs and desires. They saw me as a responsibility to be managed, an aging mother who was becoming difficult and unpredictable and needed to be controlled for her own good. And that realization, painful as it was, became the catalyst for everything that followed, including the events that would lead to that interview room at the police station where I would finally understand just how far apart we'd grown and what I needed to do about it. The cracks in my family's facade began to show themselves in ways I hadn't anticipated, small fissures that widened into chasms over the months following that disastrous dinner conversation. What started as disapproval of my European travel plans evolved into something far more insidious. A coordinated campaign to undermine my autonomy and independence under the guise of concern for my well-being. It began with phone calls. Lucas would call every few days, ostensibly to check on me, but really to monitor my activities and mood. The conversations always followed the same pattern. Casual questions about what I'd been doing, subtle inquiries about my spending habits, gentle suggestions that I might want to reconsider various decisions I'd made. He spoke to me the way one might address a child who was acting out, with that particular combination of patience and condescension that made my skin crawl. Emma took a different approach, arriving unannounced at my house on weekends with groceries and cleaning supplies, as if I'd suddenly become incapable of managing basic household tasks. She'd bustle around my kitchen, reorganizing cabinets and throwing away food that she deemed too old or unhealthy, all while maintaining a bright, cheerful demeanor that felt increasingly aggressive in its forced positivity. Sarah, true to her legal training, was more direct in her interventions. She began researching elder care options, sending me pamphlets about assisted living communities and articles about age-related cognitive decline. When I confronted her about these materials, she claimed she was just being proactive, thinking ahead to what I might need in the future. But the subtext was clear. She believed I was no longer capable of making sound decisions about my own life. David's response was perhaps the most hurtful because it came wrapped in the language of marital concern. He started questioning my purchases. When credit card statements arrived, asking why I needed new art supplies or books when I had plenty already. He'd make comments about the temperature in the house, suggesting I was being wasteful with heating and cooling costs. He began declining social invitations on both our behalves, claiming I was too tired or stressed to enjoy myself. The worst part was how coordinated their efforts seemed. I'd mentioned to Emma that I was considering taking a pottery class, and Lucas would call the next day with concerns about my exposure to clay dust and chemicals. I'd tell David about a book I'd read that challenged some political assumption he held, and Sarah would arrive with printouts about the dangers of conspiracy theories and extremist thinking. They were treating me like a problem to be solved, a malfunctioning appliance that needed repair or replacement. Every conversation became an opportunity for them to assess my mental state. Every decision I made was subject to their approval or interference. They spoke about me in my presence as if I weren't there, discussing my behavior and attitude with the detached concern of medical professionals evaluating a difficult patient. The breaking point came in early spring, 3 months after that. Initial confrontation about my travel plans. I had finally booked my trip to Europe, determined to follow through on my plans despite their opposition. I'd researched every detail carefully, purchased travel insurance, arranged for house-sitting services, and informed my doctor about my itinerary in case of emergency. I was excited and nervous and proud of myself for pushing forward with something I wanted despite their disapproval. That's when Sarah called a family meeting. I arrived at Lucas and Melissa's house on a Sunday afternoon in March, expecting another intervention about my travel plans. Instead, I walked into what felt like a tribunal. Lucas, Emma, and Sarah sat together on one side of the living room, while David and Melissa occupied chairs that had clearly been positioned to create a sense of us versus them. There were notebooks and printed documents scattered across the coffee table, and the atmosphere was formal and cold in a way that made my stomach drop. "Mom," Sarah began, her voice taking on the measured tone she probably used in depositions, "we've all been talking, and we're seriously concerned about some of the choices you've been making lately." She picked up a folder from the table and opened it with deliberate ceremony. "We've documented a pattern of behavior that suggests you might be experiencing some cognitive decline or emotional instability." I stared at her in disbelief. "You've documented my behavior?" Emma leaned forward, her expression earnest and worried. "We're not trying to gang up on you, Mom. We love you, and we're scared. You're not acting like yourself anymore." "And how exactly am I supposed to act?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Lucas cleared his throat and pulled out his own set of notes. "Well, for starters, you've become increasingly defensive and argumentative. You're making impulsive financial decisions without consulting Dad or considering the long-term consequences. You're isolating yourself from family and pursuing activities that seem inconsistent with your previous interests and values." "Inconsistent with my previous interests?" I repeated. "Lucas, do you have any idea what my previous interests were? Before I became your mother, before I became anyone's wife, what did I care about? What did I dream about? What made me happy?" The silence that followed was telling. They exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with questions they'd never thought to ask and couldn't answer. Sarah consulted her notes again. "Mom, you're 58 years old. You're talking about traveling to Europe alone, spending money on art classes and books that serve no practical purpose, expressing political opinions that you never had before. These are textbook signs of someone going through a major psychological crisis. Or," I said slowly, "they're signs of someone finally figuring out who she is after spending 34 years taking care of everyone else." Melissa, who had been silent until now, spoke up with the careful tone of someone trying to be helpful. "Mrs. Chambers, my grandmother went through something similar when she turned 60. She started making all kinds of unusual decisions, and we had to step in for her own protection. There are excellent facilities that specialize in helping people transition through these kinds of life changes." The room went very quiet. I looked at my daughter-in-law, this woman who had been part of our family for less than 2 years, and realized she was suggesting that I needed to be institutionalized for the crime of developing interests beyond childcare and housekeeping. "Facilities?" I asked. David finally spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Violet, we're not talking about anything dramatic. Just someplace where you could get the support you need to work through whatever you're going through. Someplace where professionals could help you process these feelings you're having." I stood up so abruptly that several of them flinched. "These feelings I'm having? David, the feeling I'm having is that I've wasted the last 34 years of my life trying to be what everyone else needed me to be. And now that I'm finally trying to be myself, my own family wants to have me committed." "That's not what we're saying," Emma protested, tears starting to form in her eyes. "We just want you to be happy and safe." "I am happy," I said, looking around the room at these people who were supposed to know me best. For the first time, in decades, I'm actually happy. I'm learning things, thinking about things, doing things that interest me personally. And your response is to decide that I'm mentally ill." Sarah stood up as well, her legal training clearly kicking in. "Mom, you have to understand how this looks from our perspective. You've always been stable and predictable, and suddenly you're acting completely different. You're pursuing activities that don't make sense for someone in your position." "What?" Position is that exactly? You're a wife and mother, Lucas said, as if this explained everything. You have responsibilities. You can't just decide to become a completely different person because you're bored or going through menopause or whatever this is. The casual dismissal in his voice, the assumption that my entire identity crisis could be reduced to hormonal fluctuations was the final straw. I had spent his entire life supporting his dreams, celebrating his achievements, putting his needs before my own. I had sacrificed my career, my friendships, my individual identity to be the mother he needed. And now he was sitting in judgment of me for daring to want something for myself. I'm leaving, I announced. Mom, please, Emma said, reaching for my arm. Let's just talk about this calmly. I pulled away from her touch. I've listened to you talk about me for the last hour. You've made it very clear what you think of my mental state and my life choices. There's nothing more to discuss. As I headed toward the door, Sarah called after me. Mom, if you walk out of here without agreeing to get some help, we're going to have to consider other options. I turned back to face her. Other options? Legal options, she said quietly. If we believe you're a danger to yourself or others, we have the right to pursue guardianship proceedings. The words hit me like a physical blow. My own daughter, the child I had raised and supported through law school, was threatening to have me declared legally incompetent because I wanted to take an art class and travel to Europe. You would do that? I asked. We don't want to, David said quickly. But if you're not willing to get help voluntarily. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the faces of my husband and children. These people who had consumed my entire adult life and who now saw me as nothing more than a problem to be managed. The love I had poured into them for decades felt suddenly hollow, a one-way street that had led to this moment of ultimate betrayal. I understand, I said quietly. You've made your position very clear. I left their house that day, knowing that my family, as I had known it, was over. They had drawn their lines, made their ultimatums, revealed their true feelings about who I was allowed to be, and in doing so, they had freed me from any remaining obligation to seek their approval for my choices. Over the following weeks, I began making decisions with a clarity and determination that surprised even me. I confirmed my European travel plans, booking flights and accommodations with the meticulous care I'd once brought to organizing their school events and birthday parties. I enrolled in additional art classes and joined a book club that met weekly to discuss challenging literature. I opened my own bank account, separate from the joint accounts I shared with David, and began transferring money that was legally mine. I also did something I'd never done before. I consulted with a lawyer of my own. Not because I was planning anything dramatic, but because Sarah's threat had made me realize how vulnerable I was legally and financially. I met with Patricia Hendricks, a family law attorney who specialized in elder rights and who listened to my story with the kind of professional sympathy that I found both comforting and disturbing. Mrs. Chambers, she said after I'd finished explaining my situation, what your family is describing as intervention could easily escalate into abuse. When adult children begin monitoring their parents' activities, controlling their finances, and threatening legal action to enforce compliance that crosses several important lines. She explained that while my children couldn't simply have me declared incompetent without substantial evidence of cognitive decline or mental illness, they could make my life difficult through various legal challenges. They could contest my financial decisions, seek temporary restraining orders based on claims of self-harm, or petition for emergency guardianship hearings that would require me to prove my competency rather than requiring them to prove my incapacity. The best protection, she advised, is documentation. Keep records of your activities, your decision-making processes, your financial choices. Maintain relationships with people outside your family who can attest to your mental clarity and stability. And consider putting certain legal protections in place now, while there's no question about your competency. I followed her advice, creating detailed journals of my daily activities and thoughts, maintaining regular contact with my doctor and other professionals who could vouch for my mental state, and executing advance directives that would prevent my family from making medical or financial decisions on my behalf without clear evidence of incapacity. But I also did something else, something that felt both necessary and heartbreaking. I began to distance myself emotionally from the people who had threatened me. I stopped calling them regularly, stopped dropping everything when they needed help, stopped pretending that our relationships were normal when they clearly weren't. The change was noticeable immediately. Lucas called more frequently, his voice tight with frustration when I didn't answer on the first ring or return his calls within hours. Emma showed up at my house uninvited, claiming she was worried because I seemed distant and cold. Sarah sent long emails analyzing my behavior and suggesting that my withdrawal from family activities was further evidence of my deteriorating mental state. David's reaction was the most complex. He seemed caught between his loyalty to our children and his growing awareness that their behavior toward me was problematic. There were moments when I caught him looking at me with something that might have been recognition, as if he was finally seeing me as a separate person rather than an extension of our family unit. But those moments were brief and quickly replaced by his default position of supporting whatever the children thought was best. The final confrontation came in late May, just 2 weeks before my scheduled departure for Europe. I was at home, packing and making last-minute preparations, when all 4 of them arrived together. They didn't call ahead, didn't ask permission to enter my house, just walked in as if they owned the place and had every right to be there. "Mom," Emma said, her voice strained with forced calm, "we need to talk." I looked up from the suitcase. I'd been organizing, taking in their serious expressions and coordinated arrival. "About what?" "About this trip," Lucas said. "We've decided that we can't let you go." The presumption in his voice, the casual assumption that he had the authority to control my movements was staggering. "You've decided?" Sarah stepped forward, and I noticed she was carrying a folder that looked suspiciously official. "Mom, we've been in contact with Dr. Morrison about our concerns regarding your recent behavior." Dr. Morrison was my family physician, a man I'd been seeing for routine care for over a decade. The idea that my children had been discussing my private medical information with him without my consent was both illegal and deeply violating. "What exactly did you tell Dr. Morrison?" I asked. "We shared our observations about your mood changes, your impulsive decision-making, your withdrawal from family activities," Emma said. "We asked him to evaluate whether you might be experiencing early-stage dementia or some other condition that could affect your judgment." I felt something cold and dangerous rising in my chest. "And what did Dr. Morrison say?" David cleared his throat. "He agreed that some of your recent choices seem out of character, and that it might be wise to postpone any major decisions until you've had a more thorough psychological evaluation." The betrayal was complete. My own husband and children had conspired with my doctor to pathologize my desire for independence and personal fulfillment. They had taken my newfound happiness and twisted it into evidence of mental illness. "I see," I said quietly. "And if I refuse to submit to this evaluation?" Sarah opened her folder and pulled out several official-looking documents. "We've consulted with a psychiatrist who specializes in geriatric mental health, based on our descriptions of your behavior. He's willing to sign an affidavit supporting a petition for emergency guardianship and a psychiatric hold." I stared at the papers in her hands, these legal instruments that my own daughter planned to use to strip me of my basic human rights. "You would have me involuntarily committed?" "Only if you force us to," Lucas said. "If you agree to cancel the trip and submit to a proper evaluation, none of this needs to go any further." I looked around my living room, this space where I had raised these children, where I had celebrated their birthdays, and comforted their heartbreaks and supported their dreams. The walls were covered with photographs of family vacations and school achievements, evidence of decades of love and sacrifice and devotion. And now these same children were threatening to have me imprisoned because I wanted to see the Louvre. "I need to call my lawyer," I said. "You don't need a lawyer, Mom," Emma said, her voice breaking slightly. "You just need help." I walked to the phone in my kitchen, very aware that they were all watching me, probably interpreting my desire for legal counsel as further evidence of paranoia or irrationality. I dialed Patricia Hendricks's emergency number, grateful that I'd had the foresight to arrange for after-hours support. "Patricia," I said when she answered. "They're here. They have papers." "Where are you?" she asked immediately. "At home. All 4 of them. They're threatening involuntary commitment if I don't cancel my trip and submit to psychiatric evaluation." "Do not sign anything," she said. "Do not agree to anything. I'm calling the police." "The police?" "Violet, what they're doing constitutes elder abuse and possibly extortion. You have rights, and I'm going to make sure those rights are protected." I hung up the phone and returned to the living room, where my family was waiting with expressions of concern and impatience. "What did your lawyer say?" Sarah asked. "She's calling the police." The reaction was immediate and telling. Lucas went pale, Emma started crying, and Sarah's professional composure cracked for the first time. "Why would you do that?" David asked, his voice full of hurt and confusion. "Because," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands, "what you're doing is illegal. You cannot threaten someone with involuntary commitment because you disapprove of their lifestyle choices. You cannot conspire with medical professionals to violate someone's privacy and autonomy. You cannot use legal documents to coerce compliance with your wishes." "We're trying to help you," Emma sobbed. "No," I said firmly. "You're trying to control me. There's a difference." When the police arrived 20 minutes later, the dynamics in the room shifted dramatically. Officer Patricia Williams and her partner, Officer James Chen, listened calmly as I explained the situation and showed them the threatening documents Sarah had brought. They asked to speak with my family members separately, taking statements and asking pointed questions about their concerns and the basis for their claims about my mental state. Patricia Hendricks arrived shortly after the police, her presence immediately changing the tone of the encounter from family drama to legal proceeding. She reviewed the documents Sarah had brought, asked detailed questions about the psychiatric affidavit and the process by which it had been obtained, and made it clear that several laws had been violated in the course of my family's intervention. "Mrs. Chambers," Officer Williams said after consulting with the lawyer, "based on what we've heard here tonight, there's no evidence that you pose a danger to yourself or others. The threats being made against you constitute elder abuse under state law, and the documents being used to coerce your compliance appear to have been obtained through fraudulent means." She turned to address my family. "I'm going to strongly recommend that you all step back and allow Mrs. Chambers to make her own decisions about her life and travel plans. Any further attempts to interfere with her autonomy or threaten her with legal action could result in criminal charges." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas and Emma looked genuinely shocked, as if they'd never considered that their loving concern might be perceived as abuse. Sarah's legal training was clearly kicking in as she realized the potential consequences of her actions. David just looked defeated, like a man who'd suddenly realized he was standing on the wrong side of a battle he'd never wanted to fight. After the police and my lawyer left, my family remained in my living room, none of them seeming to know what to say or do next. The comfortable assumption that they were acting in my best interests had been shattered, replaced by the uncomfortable reality that they had been attempting to control and manipulate me through threats and intimidation. "Mom," Emma finally said, her voice small and uncertain, "we really were just trying to help." I looked at her, this daughter I had carried, and nurtured and loved unconditionally for 29 years, and felt something break inside my chest. "I know you think that," I said. But helping me would have meant listening to me, supporting my choices, trusting that I'm capable of making decisions about my own life. What you did tonight was the opposite of help. They left shortly after, filing out of my house with the deflated air of people who'd lost a battle they'd been certain they would win. David lingered at the door, his hand on the frame as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. "Violet?" He finally said. "I don't know how we got here." "I do," I replied. "We got here because I stopped being what you needed me to be and started being who I actually am. And apparently, that's unacceptable to all of you." He left without another word, and I stood in my doorway watching him drive away, knowing that something fundamental had ended between us. The woman who had spent 34 years sacrificing her identity for her family's comfort was gone, and the woman who remained was someone they didn't recognize and couldn't control. 2 weeks later, I boarded a plane for Europe as planned. I spent a month traveling through France, Italy, and Spain, seeing art and architecture that took my breath away, meeting people who knew nothing about my history as a wife and mother, and who liked me simply for who I was in their presence. I painted watercolors of cathedral windows and ancient bridges, filled journals with thoughts and observations that belonged entirely to me, and felt more alive than I had in decades. When I returned, I found that my family had spent the month. I was away consulting with additional lawyers and medical professionals, building a case for my incompetency that they planned to pursue regardless of my successful trip. They had documented my absence as evidence of abandonment of family responsibilities, my travel expenses as proof of financial irresponsibility, and my refusal to submit to psychological evaluation as indication of lack of insight into my condition. The battle lines were drawn, and I realized that my choice was simple. I could submit to their control and return to being the invisible, accommodating woman I'd been before, or I could fight for my right to exist as an independent person. I chose to fight, but I had no idea how ugly that fight would become or where it would ultimately lead. The months that followed were a careful dance of legal maneuvering and family politics, with each side documenting evidence and building cases while maintaining the pretense of normal relationships. My children continued to visit and call, but now every interaction felt like a deposition, every conversation potentially becoming evidence in some future proceeding. I continued living my life as I chose to live it, taking classes and traveling and pursuing interests that brought me joy. But I was constantly aware that I was being watched and judged, that my every decision was being evaluated for signs of incompetency or irrationality. The final escalation came in October, 6 months after the confrontation in my living room, and 3 months after my return from Europe. Sarah had been building her case methodically, collecting statements from family members and medical professionals, documenting my concerning behaviors with the thoroughness she brought to her legal work. What I didn't expect was how far she was willing to go to prove her point, or how willing my other children and my husband were to support her efforts. What started as concern for my well-being had transformed into something much more sinister, a coordinated campaign to strip me of my basic rights under the guise of protection and love. The night they finally acted, the night that would change everything between us forever, began like so many others with a phone call and a request that seemed innocent enough. But by the time the evening was over, I would be sitting in a police station interview room, finally understanding the true cost of refusing to disappear quietly into the role they had chosen for me. The phone call came on a Thursday evening in October, just as I was settling down with a cup of tea and a novel I'd been looking forward to reading. The autumn air was crisp enough that I'd lit a fire in the fireplace, and the house felt cozy and peaceful in a way that had taken me months to appreciate. Living alone had initially felt foreign and somewhat frightening, but I'd gradually come to treasure the quiet autonomy of my evenings, the freedom to read what I wanted, eat what I craved, and go to bed when I felt tired rather than when someone else's schedule demanded. Emma's voice on the phone sounded strained and urgent in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Mom, we need you to come over to Sarah's apartment right away. There's been an incident. My heart jumped into my throat. Despite everything that had transpired between us over the past months, my maternal instincts were still finely tuned to respond to any hint that one of my children might be in danger. What kind of incident? Is Sarah hurt? It's complicated, Mom. She's okay physically, but something happened tonight that has all of us really shaken up. Can you just come? We're all here, and we need to talk to you. The request felt ominous in ways I couldn't quite articulate, but my concern for Sarah overrode my growing wariness about family gatherings. Of course. Give me the address again. Sarah lived in a trendy downtown loft that she'd been able to afford thanks to her signing bonus from the law firm where she'd recently started working. It was a converted warehouse building with exposed brick walls and industrial lighting, the kind of place that spoke to her sophisticated tastes and professional success. I'd only been there once before, shortly after she'd moved in, and I remembered being impressed by how mature and accomplished her living space made her seem. When I arrived, I could see through the large windows that all the lights were on and several figures were moving around inside. Lucas's car was parked outside, as was David's, which struck me as unusual since family gatherings at Sarah's apartment weren't exactly a regular occurrence. The building's security system required residents to buzz visitors up, but before I could even approach the entrance, Emma appeared at the front door, apparently having been watching for my arrival. "Mom, thank God you're here," she said, taking my arm and guiding me toward the elevator with more urgency than seemed warranted. "Sarah is really upset and we didn't know what else to do." "What happened?" I asked as we rode up to the 4th floor. "You said there was an incident, but you haven't told me anything specific." Emma's expression was difficult to read, a mixture of concern and something else I couldn't identify. "It's better if Sarah explains it herself. She's been waiting for you." The elevator doors opened directly into Sarah's loft, and I immediately saw that this was not a casual family gathering. Lucas was pacing near the windows, his phone pressed to his ear in what appeared to be a serious conversation. David was sitting on Sarah's leather couch, looking older and more tired than I'd seen him in years. And Sarah herself was curled up in an armchair near the fireplace, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth of the room, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. The scene was so dramatically staged that I felt a moment of disconnect, as if I were walking into a movie set rather than a family crisis. But Sarah's distress appeared genuine, and whatever had happened had clearly affected all of them deeply. "Sarah, sweetheart, what's wrong?" I asked, moving toward her chair with the automatic impulse to comfort my child, regardless of our recent conflicts. She looked up at me with an expression of vulnerability that reminded me of the little girl she'd once been, the baby of the family who'd always been able to melt my heart with a single look. "Mom, something terrible happened tonight. I was walking home from dinner with friends, and this man started following me." My blood went cold. "Following you? Did he hurt you? Did you call the police?" "I tried to call the police," she said, her voice trembling slightly. But when I reached for my phone, I realized I was so panicked that I couldn't think straight. I couldn't remember your number. I couldn't remember Dad's number. I couldn't even remember my own address to tell them where I was. Lucas finished his phone conversation and joined our circle, his expression grave. The guy followed her for 3 blocks before she finally managed to duck into a convenience store where the clerk helped her call us. "But that's not the worst part," Emma added, settling onto the couch next to David. When we got to her, Sarah was completely disoriented. She couldn't remember what restaurant she'd been at, couldn't describe the man who'd been following her, couldn't even remember how she'd gotten separated from her friends. I looked around at their faces, all of them focused on me with an intensity that made me increasingly uncomfortable. That's terrifying, but it's not uncommon for people to experience memory problems when they're in a state of panic or shock. The important thing is that she's safe now. Sarah leaned forward in her chair, her blanket slipping off her shoulders. "But Mom, it wasn't just tonight. I've been having memory problems for weeks now. Forgetting appointments, losing track of conversations, having trouble concentrating at work. I think something is seriously wrong with me. The pieces of this conversation were starting to form a pattern that I didn't like. Have you seen a doctor about these concerns? That's what we wanted to talk to you about, David said, speaking for the first time since I'd arrived. Sarah's been too frightened to seek medical attention on her own, and we think she needs support from all of us to get through whatever this is. Lucas nodded earnestly. We've been researching her symptoms, and they could indicate anything, from stress and anxiety to early onset dementia, or even a brain tumor. She needs to see a specialist immediately. The word dementia hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. I looked at Sarah, really looked at her, trying to assess whether she actually appeared confused or disoriented. What I saw was a young woman who seemed nervous and upset, but whose eyes were clear and whose speech was coherent. She didn't look like someone experiencing cognitive decline. She looked like someone playing a role. Sarah, I said carefully, these memory problems you're describing, when did they start? She glanced quickly at her siblings before answering. A few weeks ago, maybe a month. It's been gradual, but tonight really scared me because I realized how bad it's gotten. And you haven't mentioned any of this to me before? Another quick glance around the room. I was embarrassed. I didn't want to worry anyone until I knew more about what was happening. The story wasn't adding up. Sarah had never been shy about sharing medical concerns with the family, and the timing of her alleged symptoms coincided suspiciously with the escalation of our conflicts over my independence. But more than that, there was something performative about her distress, something rehearsed about the way she delivered her lines. I think you should definitely see a doctor, I said, but I'm not sure why you needed me to come over here tonight to discuss that decision. Emma and Lucas exchanged a look that I was clearly meant to notice. Well, Emma said slowly, we were hoping you might go with her to the appointment. For moral support. Of course I would if that's what Sarah wants. Actually, Lucas said, we were thinking it might be better if you saw the same doctor. To rule out any genetic factors or family predisposition to whatever might be affecting Sarah. And there it was. The real purpose of this elaborate theatrical production became crystal clear in that moment. They had orchestrated this entire scenario, complete with Sarah's fake panic attack and memory problems, as a way to trick me into submitting to the psychological evaluation I had refused months earlier. I stood up slowly, looking around the room at these people who had spent hours planning this deception. Let me make sure I understand what you're suggesting. Sarah claims to be having memory problems that conveniently mirror the symptoms you've been attributing to me for months, and now you want both of us to see a psychiatrist together? It's not like that, Mom, Emma protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Really? Then explain to me why Sarah's alleged memory problems started right around the time you all decided I needed psychiatric evaluation. Explain why she can't remember. Basic information during a supposed panic attack, but she can remember to call all of you and coordinate this family meeting. Sarah's performance began to crack under scrutiny. I'm not making this up, Mom. I'm really scared about what's happening to me. I'm sure you are scared, I said, but not about your memory. You're scared because your plan to have me declared incompetent isn't working, and you're running out of legal options. David finally spoke up, his voice heavy with what sounded like genuine regret. Violet, we're all worried about you. If you would just agree to see someone professionally, we could put all these concerns to rest. My concerns would be put to rest if my family stopped trying to manipulate and control me, I replied. This is a new low, even for you. Using Sarah's supposed mental health crisis to trick me into psychological evaluation is not just unethical. It's cruel. Lucas stepped forward, his face flushing with anger or embarrassment. You're being paranoid, Mom. Not everything is about you and your imaginary persecution complex. Imaginary? I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through my photo gallery. Would you like to see the legal documents Sarah brought to my house threatening involuntary commitment? Would you like to hear the recording I made of our conversation with the police officers who called your behavior elder abuse? The room went very quiet. I could see them all processing the fact that I had been documenting their attempts to control me, that I had evidence of their threats and manipulations. Sarah's facade finally crumbled completely. "Fine," she said, throwing off her blanket and standing up. "Fine, yes, we're worried about you, and yes, we think you need help. Is that what you want to hear?" "What I want to hear," I said calmly, "is an acknowledgement that you've been lying to me and manipulating me for months because you can't accept that I have the right to live my own life." "You don't have the right to destroy our family," Emma said, tears starting to flow again. "You don't have the right to just decide you're a different person and expect all of us to go along with it." "I'm not destroying our family, Emma. I'm just refusing to be the family scapegoat anymore." The conversation that followed was the most honest exchange we'd had in months, but also the most painful. All the resentments and fears that had been building beneath the surface came pouring out in an avalanche of accusations and counter-accusations. They told me that my behavior over the past year had been selfish and inconsiderate, that I was abandoning my responsibilities as a wife and mother in pursuit of frivolous personal interests. They said I was spending money recklessly, making decisions without considering how they affected the rest of the family, and refusing to accept appropriate guidance from people who loved me. I told them that their idea of love looked suspiciously like control, that they had never shown any interest in my happiness or fulfillment except when it served their needs, and that their current intervention was motivated more by their discomfort with change than by genuine concern for my well-being. Lucas accused me of having a midlife crisis that was embarrassing to the family and potentially damaging to his professional reputation. Emma blamed me for the stress that my erratic behavior was causing David, who she claimed was becoming depressed and withdrawn. Sarah, dropping all pretense of memory problems, argued that my refusal to submit to psychological evaluation was proof that I knew something was wrong with me and was too proud or scared to get help. I listened to their litany of complaints and grievances, these children I had raised and loved and sacrificed for, and realized that they had never really seen me as a separate person with my own needs and desires. In their minds, I was a supporting character in their stories, valuable only insofar as I facilitated their comfort and success. "I want all of you to leave," I said when the shouting finally died down. "I want you to leave Sarah's apartment, and I want you to leave me alone." "Mom," David said, his voice pleading, "we can work this out. We just need to find a way to communicate better." "David, there's nothing to work out. You've made your position very clear, and I've made mine clear. We fundamentally disagree about whether I have the right to be an independent person, and there's no compromise possible on that issue." As I headed toward the elevator, Sarah called after me one last time. "Mom, if you walk away from us tonight, there will be consequences. We can't just stand by and watch you self-destruct." I turned back to face her, this daughter who had threatened me with legal action, who had just attempted to deceive me with a fake mental health crisis, who was now making additional threats because I refused to submit to her control. "Sarah," I said quietly, "the only person self-destructing here is you. You've become so obsessed with controlling me that you've lost sight of basic ethics and human decency. I raised you to be better than this." I left them standing in that expensive loft apartment, looking like actors who had forgotten their lines in the middle of a play. The elevator ride down felt like descending from one world into another, from the realm of family drama and manipulation into something cleaner and more honest. But as I walked to my car, I realized that the evening's events had escalated our conflict to a new level. They had shown their willingness to lie and deceive in pursuit of their goals, and Sarah's final threat suggested that they weren't finished with their attempts to control me. I drove home through the quiet streets of the city, past houses where other families were probably settling in for peaceful evenings, watching television or helping children with homework, or simply enjoying each other's company. I envied those families their normalcy, their ability to love each other without the need for dominance and submission. When I reached my house, I immediately called Patricia Hendricks, even though it was after 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. She answered on the second ring, her voice alert and professional despite the late hour. "Violet? What's happened?" I told her about the evening's events, the staged crisis, the attempted deception, and Sarah's final threat. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. "Violet," she said when I finished, "this is escalating beyond what we discussed before. They're becoming more sophisticated in their attempts to manipulate you and more willing to cross ethical and legal boundaries. I think we need to consider more aggressive protective measures." "What kind of measures?" "Restraining orders for starters, documentation of harassment and elder abuse, possibly even criminal charges for attempted fraud, depending on how far they're willing to take this fake medical crisis." The idea of taking legal action against my own children felt surreal and heartbreaking, but I was beginning to understand that they had declared war on my independence and were willing to use any tactics necessary to win. "Let me think about it," I said. "I need some time to process what happened tonight." "Don't wait too long," Patricia warned. "Based on what you've told me, I think they're planning something more dramatic than fake panic attacks. And next time, they might not give you the opportunity to walk away." I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet living room, surrounded by the life I had built for myself over the past year. The books I was reading, the art supplies for my painting classes, the travel brochures for trips I was planning. Evidence of a woman who was finally living for herself, rather than simply existing as an extension of other people's needs. But I also understood that this life was under threat, that my family's determination to control me had crossed into dangerous territory. They had shown that they were willing to lie, manipulate, and deceive to get what they wanted. They had made threats and demonstrated their willingness to use legal and medical systems against me. Over the following days, I began to notice signs that their surveillance and interference had intensified. I received calls from my doctor's office asking about missed appointments I had never scheduled. My bank called to verify large withdrawals that I had never authorized. A social worker from the County Elder Services Department showed up at my door, claiming she was following up on reports of self-neglect and possible financial exploitation. Each incident was small and seemingly innocuous, but together they formed a pattern of systematic harassment designed to create a paper trail of evidence supporting their claims about my incompetency. They were building a case against me using bureaucratic systems that were designed to protect vulnerable seniors, but could easily be weaponized against an independent woman whose family disapproved of her choices. I documented everything, photographed every official letter, recorded every phone conversation I was legally allowed to record. I maintained detailed journals of my daily activities, my thought processes, my decision-making rationale. I was living my life as if I were already on trial, constantly aware that any action I took might be used as evidence against me. The stress was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself second-guessing decisions that should have been simple and automatic. I became hypervigilant about my appearance and behavior in public, knowing that any perceived eccentricity or absent-mindedness might be reported back to my children as evidence of decline. But I also found strength I didn't know I possessed. Each attempt to undermine my independence only reinforced my determination to maintain it. Each lie they told only clarified the truth of who I really was and what I really wanted. The final straw came 3 weeks after the incident at Sarah's apartment. I was at home on a Saturday afternoon, working on a watercolor painting of the garden I'd been cultivating in my backyard, when the doorbell rang. I assumed it was a delivery or perhaps a neighbor, but when I opened the door, I found two police officers standing on my front porch. "Mrs. Violet Chambers?" one of them asked, consulting a notepad. "Yes, that's me." "Ma'am, we've received a call about a welfare check. Someone reported that you might be in distress or danger." I invited them in, offered them coffee, and calmly explained that I was perfectly fine and had no idea who might have made such a report. They looked around my clean, well-organized home, observed my coherent speech and appropriate appearance, and seemed satisfied that there was no cause for concern. "Do you mind if I ask who called in the report?" I asked as they prepared to leave. The younger officer checked his notes. "It was your daughter, Sarah Chambers. She said she'd been trying to reach you for several days and was worried because it was unusual for you to not return her calls." After they left, I sat in my living room and finally understood that this pattern of harassment and manipulation would never end voluntarily. My children had decided that I was a problem to be solved, and they would continue escalating their tactics until either I submitted to their control or they succeeded in having me declared incompetent. That's when I made the decision that would change everything. I called Patricia Hendricks and told her I was ready to take legal action. Not just restraining orders or harassment complaints, but a comprehensive legal strategy designed to protect my rights and hold my family accountable for their behavior. "I want to sue them," I said. "I want to sue all of them for elder abuse, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and anything else you can think of." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "Violet, are you sure? Once we file these charges, there's no going back. Your relationship with your family will be permanently changed." "My relationship with my family is already permanently changed," I replied. "They've made it clear that they don't respect my autonomy or my right to live my own life. Maybe legal action is the only language they'll understand." But before we could begin preparing the lawsuit, my family made their final, most desperate move. The one that would land me in a police station at 2 a.m, finally forcing everyone involved to confront the true nature of what our family had become. The call came on a Tuesday evening in November, almost exactly 1 year after I had first asserted my independence by booking that trip to Europe. This time it was Lucas on the phone, his voice tight with what sounded like barely controlled panic. "Mom, you need to come to the emergency room at St. Mary's Hospital right away. It's about Dad." My heart stopped. Despite everything that had happened between us, David was still my husband of 34 years, the father of my children, someone I had loved deeply, even if I no longer trusted him. "What happened? Is he hurt?" "He collapsed at work. They think it might be a heart attack. The doctors need to speak with you about his medical history and treatment options." I didn't hesitate. Whatever conflicts existed between us, I would never refuse to help David in a medical emergency. I grabbed my purse and car keys and drove to the hospital as quickly as safely possible, my mind racing with fears about what I might find when I arrived. St. Mary's Hospital was a place I knew well from my nursing days, and the familiar smell of antiseptic and floor wax hit me as soon as I walked through the automatic doors. The emergency department was busy, but not chaotic, with the controlled urgency that characterizes a well-run trauma center. I approached the reception desk and identified myself as David Chambers' wife, explaining that I'd been called about his condition. The clerk checked her computer and directed me to a family consultation room where Lucas, Emma, and Sarah were already waiting. But when I walked into that room, I immediately knew something was wrong. My children were sitting calmly in their chairs, none of them showing the kind of distress I would expect from people whose father had just suffered a heart attack. They looked nervous, yes, but not grief-stricken or even particularly worried. "Where's Dad?" I asked immediately. "What room is he in? What did the doctors say?" Lucas stood up slowly, his expression serious but not devastated. "Mom, we need to talk to you about something. Dad is fine. There was no heart attack." The words hit me like a physical blow. What do you mean there was no heart attack? You said he collapsed. You said I needed to come here immediately. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. We lied. We needed to get you here, and we knew you wouldn't come if we told you the truth. I looked around the room, taking in their expressions, their posture, their obvious discomfort with what they had done. What truth? Why did you need to get me here? Sarah, ever the lawyer, took charge of the explanation. Mom, we've arranged for you to speak with Dr. Patricia Monsoon, a psychiatrist who specializes in geriatric mental health. She's here tonight, and she's willing to do an emergency evaluation based on our concerns about your recent behavior. The betrayal was so complete, so perfectly orchestrated, that for a moment I couldn't speak. They had lied about David having a heart attack, had manipulated my love and concern for my husband, had brought me to a hospital under false pretenses, for the sole purpose of tricking me into psychiatric evaluation. You used my fear for David's life to get me here, I said, my voice deadly quiet. We didn't know what else to do, Emma said, tears starting to form in her eyes. You won't listen to us. You won't get help voluntarily, and we're scared about what's going to happen to you. What's going to happen to me is that I'm going to leave this hospital right now, and I'm never going to speak to any of you again. I turned toward the door, but Lucas moved to block my path. Mom, Dr. Monsoon is already here. She's reviewed our concerns about your behavior, and she agrees that an evaluation is necessary. If you refuse to cooperate, she can initiate an involuntary hold. The threat was clear and immediate. If I tried to leave, they would have me detained against my will for psychiatric observation. I was trapped in a consultation room in a hospital, surrounded by my own children who were prepared to have me imprisoned for the crime of wanting to live independently. Let me see Dr. Monsoon, I said. But I want it understood that I'm here under duress, that I was brought here through deception, and that this entire proceeding is being conducted without my consent. Dr. Monsoon turned out to be a small, intense woman in her 50s with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She had clearly been briefed by my children, because she began the session with a series of questions about my memory, my mood, my decision-making processes, and my relationships with family members. I answered her questions honestly and directly, explaining that my memory was excellent. My mood was generally positive despite the stress of dealing with my family's harassment. My decision-making was careful and well-considered, and my relationships with family members had deteriorated because they refused to accept my autonomy. She asked about my travel plans, my financial decisions, my living situation, and my social connections. I provided detailed, rational explanations for every choice I had made, demonstrated my competency through clear communication and logical reasoning, and made it obvious that I was neither confused nor impaired. After about an hour of questioning, Dr. Monsoon asked my children to join us in the consultation room. She looked around the group with an expression that was difficult to read. Based on my evaluation, she said, I see no evidence that Mrs. Chambers is experiencing cognitive decline, mental illness, or impaired judgment. Her responses to my questions were coherent, logical, and appropriate. Her memory appears intact, her reasoning skills are excellent, and her decision-making processes are sound. The silence that followed was deafening. Lucas, Emma, and Sarah stared at the psychiatrist as if she had spoken in a foreign language. But what about her behavior changes? Sarah asked. What about her refusal to accept guidance from family members? Dr. Monsoon's expression hardened slightly. What you're describing as concerning behavior changes sound to me like normal adult development and self-actualization. Mrs. Chambers appears to be a woman who spent decades in traditional caregiving roles and is now exploring her individual identity and interests. That's not pathological, it's healthy. She turned to address me directly. Mrs. Chambers, based on my evaluation, I see no medical or psychiatric reason why you shouldn't continue living independently and making your own decisions about your life. In fact, I would recommend that you consider whether the stress you're experiencing from family conflict might benefit from individual counseling, not because there's anything wrong with you, but because navigating family dysfunction can be emotionally challenging. Then she turned back to my children, and her tone became decidedly cooler. I would also recommend that all of you consider family therapy to address the control and boundary issues that are clearly affecting your relationships. What I've witnessed tonight is not appropriate concern for a parent's well-being. It's a coordinated attempt to undermine an autonomous adult's right to self-determination. The aftermath of Dr. Monsoon's evaluation was swift and dramatic. My children's carefully constructed case for my incompetency had crumbled under professional scrutiny, leaving them exposed as the manipulative, controlling people they had become. They had brought me to a hospital under false pretenses, subjected me to psychiatric evaluation without cause, and been publicly rebuked by the very professional they had hoped would validate their concerns. But rather than accepting Dr. Monsoon's assessment and backing down, they doubled down on their efforts to control me. As we left the hospital that night, Sarah made one final threat that would set in motion the events that led to my arrest. "This isn't over, Mom," she said as we stood in the hospital parking lot. "If you won't accept help voluntarily, we'll find other ways to protect you from yourself." I looked at her, this daughter I had raised and educated and loved, who was now threatening me in the parking lot of a hospital where she had just been told by a medical professional that I was completely competent. "Sarah," I said calmly, "if you continue to harass me, if you continue to interfere with my life, if you make any more attempts to control me through legal or medical means, I will file criminal charges against you and your siblings for elder abuse. Do you understand me?" She stared at me for a long moment, her jaw set in the stubborn line I remembered from her childhood. "We'll see about that." As I drove home that night, I realized that the war for my independence was entering its final phase. My children had shown that they were willing to lie, manipulate, and abuse institutional systems to get what they wanted. They had demonstrated that no boundary was too sacred to cross, no deception too cruel to employ. But they had also revealed their fundamental weakness. Their case against me was built on lies and manipulation rather than facts and evidence. When subjected to professional scrutiny, their claims about my incompetency had been completely debunked. What I didn't anticipate was how far they would go in their final desperate attempt to regain control, or how that attempt would ultimately provide me with the evidence I needed to end their harassment once and for all. The weeks following the hospital incident passed in an uneasy quiet that felt more ominous than peaceful. My children stopped calling daily, stopped showing up unannounced at my house, stopped sending me articles about cognitive decline and elder care facilities. On the surface, it appeared that Dr. Monsoon's professional assessment had finally convinced them to respect my autonomy and independence. But I had lived with these three determined individuals for too many years to believe they would simply accept defeat and walk away. Instead, I sensed they were regrouping, developing a new strategy that would be more sophisticated and harder for me to detect or defend against. The silence felt tactical rather than resigned, like the calm before, a storm that was still gathering strength somewhere beyond the horizon. I used this period of apparent peace to strengthen my own position. Patricia Hendricks and I worked together to document everything that had transpired over the past year, creating a comprehensive timeline of my family's attempts to control and manipulate me. We gathered evidence of their false reports to medical professionals, their fraudulent welfare checks, their attempts to access my financial information without authorization, and their systematic campaign of harassment and intimidation. Patricia also helped me establish additional legal protections for my independence. We created detailed advance directives that specifically prohibited my children from making medical or financial decisions on my behalf, except in cases of documented incapacity, confirmed by multiple independent physicians. We established a healthcare proxy relationship with Dr. Morrison, my longtime physician, who had been horrified to learn how his office had been manipulated into participating in my family's scheme. I also took practical steps to insulate myself from their interference. I changed banks, moving my accounts to an institution where I had no previous relationship and where my children would have no informal access to information about my finances. I updated all my insurance policies and retirement accounts to remove David as beneficiary, replacing him with charitable organizations that reflected my values and interests. Most importantly, I began building a support network of people who knew me as Violet Chambers the individual rather than as someone's wife or mother. My art instructor, Margaret Torres, became a close friend who understood my journey toward self-discovery and supported my creative endeavors. The women in my book club provided intellectual stimulation and social connection that had nothing to do with my family roles. My neighbors, Helen and Robert Martinez, were a retired couple who treated me as an equal and enjoyed my company without any agenda or expectation. These relationships gave me something I hadn't realized I'd been missing for decades: the experience of being valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. Margaret appreciated my artistic eye and my willingness to experiment with new techniques. The book club members respected my insights and opinions about literature and current events. Helen and Robert enjoyed my sense of humor and my stories about my travels. For the first time since my children had become adults, I felt truly seen and appreciated by people who had no investment in keeping me small or controllable. But even as I was building this new life and these new connections, I remained vigilant about my family's next move. I installed security cameras around my property, not because I was paranoid, but because I had learned that documentation was my best protection against their accusations and manipulations. I kept detailed logs of my daily activities, not because I doubted my own memory, but because I knew they would continue looking for evidence of incompetency or decline. I also began researching elder abuse laws and advocacy resources, educating myself about the legal remedies available to seniors who were being harassed or controlled by their own family members. What I learned was both encouraging and disturbing. The legal system did recognize elder abuse as a serious crime, but proving it could be difficult when the perpetrators were family members acting under the guise of concern and protection. The case law was full of stories similar to my own. Competent older adults whose children or spouses had used medical and legal systems to strip them of their autonomy, often successfully. Courts were sometimes reluctant to intervene in family disputes, especially when the alleged abusers could present themselves as loving children who were simply worried about an aging parent. But there were also success stories, cases where seniors had fought back against family control and won. These victories typically involved extensive documentation, professional testimony about the victim's competency, and clear evidence of the family's manipulative or abusive behavior. I was determined to be prepared for whatever came next, but I was also trying to live my life rather than simply defend it. I continued taking art classes and made plans for another trip to Europe in the spring. I started volunteering at a local literacy center, teaching adults to read, which gave me a sense of purpose and contribution that felt authentic and meaningful. I was also writing. Not journaling for legal protection, but actually writing about my experience of rediscovering myself after decades of invisibility. It started as personal reflection, but gradually became something more structured and intentional. I found that putting my story into words helped me understand not just what had happened to me, but why it had happened and what it meant. The writing process also helped me process the grief I was experiencing about my family relationships. Despite everything they had done to try to control me, I still loved my children. I grieved for the close relationships we had once shared, for the family traditions that would probably never resume, for the future I had imagined where I would be a beloved grandmother surrounded by children and grandchildren who valued my presence in their lives. But I also felt a sense of liberation that was profound and transformative. For the first time in my adult life, I was living according to my own values and desires rather than constantly adapting myself to meet other people's expectations. I was making decisions based on what would make me happy and fulfilled, rather than what would keep everyone else comfortable. The freedom was intoxicating in ways I hadn't anticipated. I could read whatever books interested me without considering whether they were appropriate for a woman of my age and station. I could travel wherever I wanted without asking permission or justifying the expense to people who had never contributed to my savings account. I could express political opinions, artistic preferences, and personal values that were mine alone, rather than carefully calibrated to avoid family conflict. I was becoming the person I might have been if I had never learned to disappear into the role of wife and mother, and that person was far more interesting and complex than I had dared to hope. But this period of growth and discovery came to an abrupt end on a cold Tuesday evening in January, when my family finally revealed their ultimate strategy for regaining control over my life. The evening started normally enough. I had spent the afternoon at the literacy center working with Maria, a young mother who was learning to read so she could help her children with their homework. It was rewarding work that made me feel useful in ways that had nothing to do with family obligation or traditional female roles. When I arrived home around 6 o'clock, I noticed that the streetlight in front of my house was out, creating an unusually dark pool around my driveway. I made a mental note to call the city about the repair, but didn't think much of it at the time. I parked in my garage as usual, gathered my purse and the books I'd been using for tutoring, and headed for the door that connected the garage to my kitchen. That's when I realized something was wrong. The motion sensor light that normally illuminated the side yard when I came home hadn't activated, and there were sounds coming from inside my house that shouldn't have been there. Not burglar sounds exactly, but voices and movement that suggested people were inside my home without my permission. I stood frozen in my garage for several moments, trying to decide what to do. Should I go back to my car and drive away? Should I call the police from my cell phone? Should I try to enter the house and see who was there? Before I could make a decision, the door to the kitchen opened, and Emma appeared in the doorway. She looked surprised to see me, as if she hadn't expected me to come home at my usual time. "Mom," she said, her voice artificially bright. "There you are. We've been waiting for you." "We?" I asked, my stomach sinking as I realized this was not a coincidental visit. Lucas emerged from behind Emma, followed by Sarah and, most shockingly, David. All four of them were standing in my kitchen, having apparently entered my house without my knowledge or consent while I was away. "How did you get into my house?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. David held up a key, looking embarrassed but defiant. "I still had my key from when we lived here together. I know you changed the locks, but I had a duplicate made before you did." The violation was stunning. They had secretly copied my house key and used it to enter my home without permission. They had been inside my private space, going through my belongings, violating my sanctuary. "Get out," I said simply. "All of you, get out of my house right now." "Mom, we need to talk," Lucas said, his tone reasonable but firm. "We've been trying to reach you for weeks, but you've been avoiding our calls and refusing to meet with us. I've been avoiding you because every interaction we have turns into an attempt to control or manipulate me. I have nothing to say to any of you." Sarah stepped forward, and I noticed she was carrying a thick folder of documents. "Actually, Mom, you do need to talk to us, because we filed a petition with the court requesting an emergency guardianship hearing." The words hit me like a physical blow. "You've done what?" "We filed for emergency guardianship," she repeated, her lawyer voice cool and professional. "Based on documented evidence of your increasingly erratic behavior, your refusal to accept appropriate medical care, and your pattern of making decisions that put your health and financial security at risk." Emma pulled out her phone and began reading from what appeared to be a prepared statement. "We have witness testimony from family members, medical professionals, and community members documenting your dramatic personality changes, your social isolation, your reckless spending habits, and your resistance to reasonable guidance from people who care about you. I looked around at their faces. These people who had once been the center of my world, who had just informed me that they were attempting to have me declared legally incompetent and stripped of my basic human rights. "What witnesses?" I asked. "What medical professionals? Dr. Monsoon specifically said I was competent and that your concerns were unfounded." Lucas pulled out his own set of documents. Dr. Monsoon's evaluation was conducted under duress and wasn't comprehensive enough to identify subtle cognitive changes. We've since consulted with Dr. Richard Stromberg, a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in cases like yours. Cases like mine? Seniors who are experiencing cognitive decline but lack the insight to recognize their condition, Sarah explained. Dr. Stromberg reviewed our documentation of your behavior and agreed that your resistance to evaluation and treatment is consistent with dementia-related anosognosia. I stared at her in disbelief. "You had me diagnosed with dementia by a doctor who has never examined me?" "Dr. Stromberg is willing to testify that your refusal to submit to proper evaluation is itself evidence of impaired judgment," Emma said. "Combined with the documented behavior changes, the financial irregularities, and the family disruption you've caused, it's sufficient grounds for emergency guardianship." The sophistication of their strategy was breathtaking. They had learned from their previous failures and crafted an approach that turned my competency and independence into evidence of incompetency. My refusal to submit to unnecessary psychiatric evaluation became proof that I lacked insight into my condition. My financial independence became evidence of poor judgment. My insistence on living my own life became proof that I was a danger to myself. "Who would be my guardian?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Sarah," David said. "She's the most qualified legally, and she's willing to take on the responsibility." The irony was perfect. The daughter who had threatened me, lied to me, and manipulated me for over a year would become legally empowered to control every aspect of my life. She would decide where I lived, how I spent my money, what medical care I received, and who I was allowed to see. "The hearing is scheduled for Thursday morning," Sarah continued. "We wanted to give you advance notice so you could prepare appropriately." "How generous of you," I said. "And what exactly does preparing appropriately entail?" Lucas consulted his notes. "You'll need to appear in court and demonstrate your competency to the judge. You're welcome to have legal representation, but the burden of proof is on you to show that guardianship isn't necessary." The legal system had been turned upside down. Instead of my accusers having to prove their case, I would have to prove my innocence. Instead of being presumed competent until proven otherwise, I would have to demonstrate my competency to the satisfaction of a judge who would be hearing only their version of events. "You should also know," Emma added, "that we've prepared temporary living arrangements for you during the transition period. There's a very nice assisted living facility that specializes in residents with cognitive challenges." "You've already arranged to have me institutionalized?" "We've made preliminary arrangements," David corrected. "Nothing is final until after the hearing, but we wanted to be prepared to act quickly in your best interests." I looked around my kitchen, this space that I had made my own over the past year, filled with evidence of my independence and autonomy. My art supplies were arranged on the counter where I'd been working on a painting of winter trees. Books I was reading were stacked near the coffee maker. Travel brochures for my planned spring trip to Italy were spread across the table. All of it would disappear if they succeeded. My home, my freedom, my right to make choices about my own life. I would become a ward of the state, managed by the daughter who saw my independence as a threat that needed to be eliminated. "I want all of you to leave my house immediately," I said, "and I want you to give me back the key you've been using to enter without permission." "Mom?" Emma said. her voice taking on the pleading tone she'd used as a child when she wanted something. "We're not doing this to hurt you. We're doing it because we love you, and we're scared about what's happening to you." "If you loved me," I replied, "you would respect my right to live my own life. What you're doing isn't love, it's control disguised as protection." Sarah stepped forward with her folder of documents. "These are copies of everything we'll be presenting to the court. Financial records showing irregular spending patterns, medical records documenting your refusal to seek appropriate care, statements from family members and observers describing your behavioral changes." I took the folder without opening it. I didn't need to read their version of my life to understand what they had constructed. They had taken every moment of independence, every assertion of autonomy, every refusal to be controlled, and reframed it as evidence of incompetency. "There's one more thing," Lucas said as they prepared to leave. "We've also filed for a temporary restraining order preventing you from making any major financial decisions or travel plans until after the hearing. Your bank accounts have been frozen pending the court's decision." The final blow was delivered with casual efficiency. They had not only threatened my freedom, they had already begun stripping it away. I couldn't access my own money, couldn't make plans for my future, couldn't even leave town without violating a court order. After they left, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the documents they had prepared to destroy my life, and realized that I was experiencing the dark side of family, relationships that most people never had to confront. The people who were supposed to love and protect me had become my greatest threat, using their intimate knowledge of my life and their family connections to systematically dismantle my independence. But I also realized that they had made a crucial mistake. In their eagerness to build a case against me, they had documented their own campaign of harassment and manipulation. The very evidence they planned to use to prove my incompetency would also demonstrate their pattern of abusive behavior toward a competent adult. I called Patricia Hendricks despite the late hour, knowing that I had less than 48 hours to prepare for the most important legal battle of my life. "Patricia," I said when she answered, "they've filed for emergency guardianship. The hearing is Thursday morning." "I've been expecting this," she said. "How are you holding up?" "I'm angry," I admitted, "and I'm scared, but I'm also determined to fight this with everything I have." "Good," she said, "because we're going to need that determination. Emergency guardianship cases are difficult to defend because the standard of evidence is lower and the time frame is compressed, but we have advantages they don't know about." Over the next 36 hours, Patricia and I worked around the clock to prepare my defense. We gathered statements from Dr. Monsoon, my physician Dr. Morrison, my art instructor Margaret Torres, the staff at the Literacy Center where I volunteered, and my neighbors Helen and Robert Martinez. Each statement testified to my competency, my clarity of thought, my independence, and my positive contributions to my community. We also compiled evidence of my family's campaign of harassment and manipulation. The recordings I had made of their threats, the documents they had used to try to coerce me into psychiatric evaluation, the false reports they had filed with various agencies, the fraudulent welfare checks they had requested. Most importantly, we prepared a comprehensive financial analysis that demonstrated the careful and responsible nature of my spending decisions. Far from the reckless behavior my family alleged, my financial records showed a pattern of thoughtful planning and appropriate risk management. Patricia also arranged for an independent psychiatric evaluation by Dr. Elizabeth Reyes, a respected geriatric psychiatrist who had no prior contact with my family or their chosen expert. Dr. Reyes spent 3 hours evaluating my cognitive function, emotional state, and decision-making capacity, and concluded that I showed no signs of dementia, depression, or any other condition that would impair my judgment. But even as we prepared our defense, I understood that the legal system's bias toward family intervention meant that we would be fighting an uphill battle. Courts were generally reluctant to dismiss concerns raised by loving children, especially when those children could present themselves as professionals acting in their mother's best interests. The hearing itself took place in a sterile courtroom that smelled of floor wax and nervous sweat. Judge Margaret Chen was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes who listened carefully to both sides of the argument. Sarah presented their case with the clinical precision she brought to her legal work, outlining what she characterized as a pattern of concerning behavioral changes and poor judgment. She called David as a witness, who testified about my withdrawal from family activities and my resistance to guidance. Lucas testified about my inappropriate financial decisions and travel plans. Emma testified about my social isolation and personality changes. Dr. Richard Stromberg, the psychiatrist who had never examined me, testified via video conference about the likelihood that my behavior indicated early-stage dementia with anosognosia, explaining that my refusal to accept their concerns was itself a symptom of cognitive decline. It was a masterful performance, crafted to present them as loving family members struggling to protect a declining parent who lacked the insight to recognize her own limitations. But Patricia's cross-examination revealed the weaknesses in their case. Under questioning, David admitted that he had not lived with me for over a year and had limited knowledge of my daily activities. Lucas acknowledged that he had never asked about my reasons for my financial decisions before concluding they were inappropriate. Emma conceded that she had not attempted to participate in any of my new activities before deciding they represented unhealthy social isolation. Dr. Stromberg's testimony crumbled under scrutiny when Patricia revealed that his assessment was based entirely on second-hand reports from family members with obvious conflicts of interest, and that he had ignored the contrary opinion of Dr. Monsoon, who had actually examined me. Then Patricia presented our case. Dr. Reyes testified about my excellent cognitive function and emotional stability. My physician testified about my appropriate self-care and medical compliance. My neighbors testified about my positive contributions to the community and my obvious competency in managing daily life. The Literacy Center director testified that I was one of their most reliable and effective volunteers, demonstrating patience, intelligence, and excellent judgment in working with vulnerable adults. Margaret Torres testified that my artistic development showed clear thinking and creative growth that would be impossible in someone experiencing cognitive decline. Most powerfully, Patricia presented the evidence of my family's campaign of harassment and manipulation. The recordings of their threats, the documentation of their false reports to authorities, the evidence of their systematic efforts to undermine my independence through deception and intimidation. Judge Chen listened to all the testimony with careful attention, asking pointed questions that suggested she understood the complexity of the situation. When both sides had finished presenting their cases, she announced that she would recess to consider her decision. The waiting period felt endless. I sat in the courthouse hallway with Patricia, watching my family huddled together across the room, all of us suspended between one reality and another. If Judge Chen granted their petition, I would leave the courthouse as a ward of the state, my independence legally terminated. If she denied it, I would walk out free but with the knowledge that my family had tried to destroy my autonomy and might try again. When we were called back into the courtroom, Judge Chen looked tired but resolute. She had clearly given careful consideration to a case that was more complex than it had initially appeared. This court has reviewed all the evidence and testimony presented by both parties, she began, and I find myself deeply troubled by what I've heard here today. My heart sank, assuming her concern would favor my family's petition. I am troubled, she continued, not by Mrs. Chambers' behavior, which appears to be that of a competent adult making reasonable decisions about her own life, but by the behavior of her family members, who have engaged in a systematic campaign to undermine her autonomy through harassment, deception, and manipulation. I felt Patricia's hand squeeze my arm as we realized which direction the judge's decision was heading. The evidence shows clearly that Mrs. Chambers is a competent adult who has made thoughtful decisions about her living situation, her finances, her social activities, and her personal relationships. The fact that her family disapproves of these decisions does not constitute grounds for guardianship. Judge Chen looked directly at my children as she continued. Furthermore, this court finds that the petitioners have engaged in elder abuse, as defined by state law, using legal and medical systems to intimidate and control an autonomous adult. Their behavior constitutes harassment and potentially criminal conduct. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Sarah's carefully constructed case had not just failed, it had backfired spectacularly, exposing their actions as abusive rather than protective. The petition for emergency guardianship is denied, Judge Chen concluded. Mrs. Chambers retains all her rights and freedoms. Additionally, I am issuing restraining orders preventing all 4 petitioners from contacting Mrs. Chambers except through legal counsel, from entering her property without permission, and from interfering with her financial or medical affairs. I sat in stunned silence as the reality of complete victory washed over me. Not only had I retained my independence, but the court had officially recognized my family's behavior as abusive and had legally protected me from further harassment. But even as I celebrated this vindication, I understood that the victory came at an enormous personal cost. The people I had loved and sacrificed for had just been legally prohibited from contacting me because their behavior toward me had been deemed abusive. As we left the courthouse, I caught a glimpse of my family standing together near their cars, looking defeated and confused. Emma was crying, Lucas was gesturing angrily as he spoke to a lawyer, and Sarah was staring at the ground with the expression of someone who had just realized the magnitude of her miscalculation. David looked directly at me for a moment, and I saw something in his eyes that might have been regret or recognition or simply exhaustion. But then he turned away, and I understood that whatever chance we might have had to repair our relationship had been destroyed by the events of the past year. Patricia drove me home, where I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the life I had fought so hard to protect. The art supplies, the books, the travel brochures, the evidence of a woman who had finally learned to live for herself, rather than simply existing as an extension of other people's needs. I had won my independence completely and definitively, but I had also lost my family, possibly forever. It was a bittersweet victory that would reshape every aspect of my future, beginning with the decision I would make that very evening about how to use the freedom I had fought so hard to secure. 6 months after the courthouse victory, I stood in the kitchen of my new home in Santa Fe, New Mexico, watching the sunrise paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The house was smaller than my previous home, but perfectly suited to my needs, with large windows that flooded the rooms with natural light and a studio space where I could paint without interruption. The move had been both practical and symbolic. After the restraining orders were issued, staying in the same city as my family felt impossible. Every grocery store, every coffee shop, every familiar street corner carried the weight of memories I needed to release. Starting fresh in a new place allowed me to fully embrace the woman I had become without the constant reminder of who I used to be. Santa Fe had welcomed me with open arms. The artistic community was vibrant and inclusive, filled with people who understood that creativity could blossom at any age. I'd joined a painting group that met twice weekly, signed up for pottery classes at the local community college, and volunteered at a women's shelter where my nursing background proved invaluable. My bank account, once frozen by my family's legal machinations, now reflected careful but confident spending on things that brought me genuine joy. I'd purchased quality art supplies, enrolled in a photography workshop, and planned a solo trip to Morocco that would happen in the fall. Each expenditure was a small act of rebellion against the years I'd spent denying myself simple pleasures in service of other people's priorities. The legal aftermath of the guardianship hearing had been swift and decisive. Patricia Hendricks had filed countersuits for elder abuse, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Rather than face criminal charges and potential disbarment for Sarah, my family had agreed to a settlement that included financial compensation for my legal fees and a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The money meant less to me than the official recognition that I had been wronged. For months, I'd been gaslit into believing that my desire for independence was evidence of mental illness. Having a court validate my competency and condemn their behavior provided a closure that no amount of financial compensation could match. Patricia had also helped me create an ironclad legal framework to protect my future autonomy. My advance directives were bulletproof, my estate planning was comprehensive, and my medical care was managed by professionals who understood my history and respected my right to self-determination. But perhaps the most significant change was emotional rather than legal. I had stopped waiting for their approval, stopped hoping they would eventually understand and accept my choices, stopped carrying the weight of their disappointment and anger. The grief of losing my family relationships was real and profound, but it was a clean grief, uncomplicated by the ongoing toxicity that had characterized our interactions for over a year. I received occasional updates about their lives through mutual acquaintances. Lucas had been promoted at his tech company but was reportedly struggling with depression. Emma had taken a leave of absence from her journalism career to focus on therapy and family counseling. Sarah had quietly left her prestigious law firm, though whether voluntarily or due to professional consequences from her actions was unclear. David had filed for divorce 3 months after the hearing, citing irreconcilable differences. The papers had been served through attorneys, and our entire 34-year marriage was dissolved without us speaking a single word to each other. He kept the house we'd shared, along with his practice and most of our joint assets, while I received my fair share of retirement accounts and investments. The divorce felt like the final severing of ties to a life that had never truly been mine. I signed the papers with relief rather than sadness, grateful to be legally free from a relationship that had become another form of control masquerading as love. My new life in Santa Fe was quieter, but infinitely richer than anything I'd experienced as a wife and mother. I woke each morning with anticipation rather than obligation, making decisions based on my own interests and energy levels rather than external demands and expectations. I'd developed genuine friendships with women who knew nothing of my history as a devoted wife and sacrificing mother. To them, I was simply Violet, an artist and volunteer who brought interesting perspectives to book club discussions and could be counted on to help with community projects. The woman who had once defined herself entirely through service to others had discovered that she was actually quite interesting on her own. I had opinions about politics and art, preferences about food and travel, dreams about future adventures that belonged to no one but myself. I still painted watercolors, but now I also worked in oils and acrylics, experimenting with bold colors and abstract forms that would have seemed inappropriate for the conservative wife and mother I'd once been. My art instructor in Santa Fe encouraged my willingness to take risks, to push boundaries, to create beauty that served no purpose except my own satisfaction. The literacy center where I volunteered had become a source of deep fulfillment. Working with women who were learning to read as adults reminded me daily of the transformative power of education and self-improvement. Many of them were escaping domestic violence or poverty, rebuilding their lives from scratch in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. Their courage inspired my own continued growth and reinforced my belief that it's never too late to become who you're meant to be. One evening, as I sat on my back patio watching the sunset over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment of peace and authenticity. The cost had been enormous. I'd lost my marriage, my relationship with my children, and the comfortable fiction that family love was unconditional. But what I'd gained was immeasurable: my integrity, my autonomy, my right to exist as a complete person rather than a supporting character in other people's stories. I discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, more resilient than my family had believed, and more worthy of love and respect than I'd been taught to expect. The phone on my kitchen counter rarely rang anymore, and when it did, it was usually Margaret calling about our next painting expedition or Helen inviting me to join her book club for their monthly discussion. Simple invitations from people who valued my company rather than my services. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if my children would ever understand what they had put me through or recognize the damage they had caused to our relationships. I wondered if David ever regretted the way our marriage had ended, if he missed the partnership we'd once shared before it became twisted into something controlling and conditional. But those moments of wondering grew shorter and less frequent as time passed. I was learning to live in the present rather than the past, to focus on the life I was building rather than the life I had lost. As I prepared for bed that evening, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was struck by how different I looked from the woman who had sat in that police station interview room less than a year ago. My silver hair was styled in a way that pleased me rather than David. My clothes reflected my personal taste rather than what was appropriate for a family gathering. My face showed the lines of someone who had lived through difficult times, but emerged stronger and more authentic. I was 61 years old, financially secure, legally protected, emotionally healthy, and completely free to live according to my own values and desires. It had taken me 6 decades to reach this point, but I finally understood what it meant to be truly alive rather than simply existing in service to others. The woman who had once disappeared into the roles of wife and mother had been reborn as someone far more interesting and complex than anyone in her family had ever bothered to discover. And for the first time in her adult life, she was exactly where she belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.